Nice to meet all you. I know most of you. The ones I don't know. I'm a therapist. I've been at Precise at the end of this month for 20 years. Yeah. I worked in Charlotte a few years at CMC before that at a pretty huge place. And then before that, back before you didn't even have to be a therapist, you could just be anybody that trained. I worked at Lincoln in a smaller hospital. So I've been doing this for a little while. I worked with most of you somewhere in the ICUs or something. But that's a little about me. What they wanted me to talk about was ventilators. I don't have no clue. It's probably a wide-ranging knowledge base of what y'all know about ventilators already. I know some of you work with them a lot, some may not. So what we're going to do first, if it's okay, is go through the modes of ventilation. Not all of them, because I learned when I was researching this that there's about 50-something modes of ventilation with different names. The reason that is because their name, there's no system to name a mode of ventilation. It's not any company that makes a vent can call their mode anything they want. So you'll have 4 or 5 names for the same mode of ventilation. So that's why there's so many out there. We're going to focus on basically 5, and that pretty much all of those are variations on those 5. Some of them y'all won't see. This won't do. Y'all won't need to see. But you might understand after we talk about what makes a mode and all that, if you ever do see them. There are, a mode of ventilation is basically, it is a breath pattern. It is a pattern of breaths delivered by the machine. How it delivers those and how it controls those is what, the characteristics of the breath is what makes the mode. So basically there's 3 breath patterns that start, that are technically the modes. There's a couple variations that now have adopted names as a mode itself, but really isn't, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the first mode and the most used anywhere is assist control. And it's kind of what it says, assist control. I'm sure y'all seen it called CMV at other places, which really isn't correct. CMV is complete mandatory ventilation. It's used mostly these days in the true sense of the word in ORs where the patients are paralyzed or so sedated they have no effort whatsoever. And the reason is because a patient cannot trigger a breath in true CMV mode. It's going to give them 10 if you set 10. If they want 12, they don't get 12, they get 10. So it's extremely uncomfortable in an awake patient. So we don't use it. What y'all see, and ventilators don't put it on there, you may see it come from a small place, but what they're talking about is assist control. It's the same as what we call assist control. And that's why this is so confusing, is one company calls it CMV, if the others got it patented as assist control, they have to come up with something different. And so we'll start with the 3 different breath patterns, and those are the basis for the 5 modes, technically, that we're going to call them tonight. So the first is assist control, all right? In assist control, it's the one we use on the sickest people. It gives them the most help of any mode out there as far as the breath patterns. It is made up basically of one type of breath, and that no matter what triggers the breath, and this is where it gets confusing. We call things sometimes in the hospital, and y'all may too, by what different pieces of the mode. Like assist control, the machine will give you a breath. The breath has a lot of parameters that you dial in. All right, say you're going to put somebody on assist control, you can set a tidal volume. That's the amount of air that goes in with each breath. On these vents, you can set how fast that air goes in, and that's huge when it comes to helping a patient, and I'll go into more detail with that. And then, of course, you set your basic PEEP and FiO2 and those things. That's one kind of breath. It's called a mandatory breath. The machine, we call it by what triggered it, a machine breath, because the machine triggers it. If you put them on a rate of 10, every 6 seconds, they're going to get a breath, okay? And I'm going to draw some stuff up here right quick that'll help us with this. All right, this part of the scale is pressure on this waveform. And why I'm doing this, I know y'all don't use waveforms, this event doesn't have it, we use them religiously in the hospital. If you ask somebody to describe what is a breath, you can't see a breath. I mean, you have to find a way to draw it to compare them. Okay, so what I'm going to draw is the pressure that's generated by the breath, and I'll explain it a little bit more in a second. It's kind of like an EKG for a heart rate. It has parts to it, and those parts are what makes the breath different. All right, so this is pressure, and this is, of course, time. Okay. There's three parts to a breath once it's started. That's what I need. Okay. And this is going to be, this is a flow waveform, okay? This is the air going, like you hear now, the air coming into the patient and out of the patient. That's what I'm going to draw. All right. And assist control volume, and I'll explain the volume part in a second. When it's time for a breath, the machine immediately goes up and it starts to flow. Say this is 60. That ain't right very good.
Use that.
I'll find one. There we go. All right, they're all going to be black. Okay.
Anyway,
Right.
the ones on the board for the
This will be good. I'm good. But anyway, the machine immediately, when it's time for a breath, when the machine says, all right, 10 seconds has passed, it's time to give a breath. So it immediately starts to flow out, and that's the flow setting on volume ventilation that you have to set. If I have a patient on volume, let's see if I can do this real quick. Switch it to volume. 500 tighter volume, inspiratory, press support. There's flow. So y'all said inspiratory time on this one. That's PRVC. That's not even out.
We don't set it.
We don't set it though.
Well, I'm hoping maybe you will when we're
But
done.
yeah, maybe
That
you
would
can
be
help us
awesome.
out.
Those are the default settings.
Yeah, and I'm going to take one quick second because this is truly, the way it's set up right now, is not volume ventilation. It's called PRVC. In true volume ventilation, you set how fast the air goes into the patient. In a pressure mode, you don't set the flow of going into the patient. You set how long that breath should take. And the machine sets the flow. So what's different about your vents is I've got a volume set, but I also have an inspiratory time set. I don't set a flow. And if anybody here can tell me, is there another option on that? Because I don't know this vent that well, but I don't think so. Is there anywhere that you can change and make this where you can set an inspiratory flow? And I don't see it listed anywhere. Which is okay. We can work with that. That's good. Yeah, and it's always going to have an eye time, but volume, go back to volume real quick. All right, well then I'll show you this then. All right, so it does it based on an inspiratory time, and what it means is, it says I've got to get 500 cc's into the patient's lung, and I got to do it in a second, okay? So if I was trying to get 500 cc's in somebody's lungs, and I was going to do it in half a second, what would have to change? How fast I'm blowing the air in. I'd have to blow it in twice as fast, okay? That's what's different about your vents. You get to set the eye time. You don't have to set the inspiratory flow. It's going to calculate and do that for you. So what I would do at an outlying hospital, if they have them on volume ventilation, they're going to have a set rate, a set tidal volume, and instead of an eye time that's set, they're going to have an inspiratory flow, which could be like 60 liters a minute, 70 liters a minute. If you increase that 60 liters a minute, the time it takes to get that breath in is less, meaning your eye time is less. So if I was going to pick up a patient in some little hospital, Lincoln or somewhere, and they were on volume ventilation with these settings, the only setting that would be different on theirs is this would not be a setting, it would be a measurement, meaning it can vary, but they would have a flow instead. So when you're getting settings from a therapist, a nurse, whoever at a small hospital, and they're on volume ventilation, ask them what the measured eye time is. You can enter that here, and it will basically calculate the same flow that they're using on their machine. They're going to set it on a flow of 60, and then they're going to measure the eye time. Your machine is different. You set the eye time, and it dictates the flow, all right? So that's a little bit different than our ventilators or any others. That's actually a nice feature, but you have to kind of treat it a little different. and what you ask from them, because if you get their exact settings, they're going to say a rate of 8, 500, 60 inspiratory flow, or 70 inspiratory flow, and then you're going to say, where do I enter the inspiratory flow? Instead, ask them the eye time. They'll check the part of the vent that has measurements, and they'll say it's running 0.92. Then set yours at 0.9, and you'll have almost the same flow. Okay? That's going to make it a little different when you're trying to synchronize with a patient, because you'll have to manipulate the time instead of the flow, and it's simple once you do it. But this is flow. So, say that machine's going to get 500, and the eye time is 1 second. The machine knows within, all right, that would be 1 second from here to here, which is a little short. Let's make this different. Let's say this is going to be 1 second. The machine knows to get that volume in 1 second, and the machine, on most machines these days, it starts to flow out at the highest point, just like when we breathe in. When I suck in, the first part of me sucking in is fast, and as I finish, my lungs fill up, I slow that flow down, and then I exhale, okay? We have vents that'll do that. We have vents that'll have a straight waveform, which is it starts at 60, it finishes at 60. It's a very constant inspiratory flow. It's not normal to a patient. Your vent is going to automatically kick to this, which is the most comfortable. It's most mimicking a normal breath, and it's also going to set that flow based on your eye time. So for you guys to change that flow, which can be important later when I'm talking about how to make somebody more comfortable, instead of going from 60 to 80 liters a minute because they're sucking in, you shorten your eye time, and that makes the flow go up. Okay? Shorter eye times is faster flows into the patient. And it's all about matching what they're doing. So if they're sucking in at 80 and you're blowing in at 60, it's like they're sucking on a straw to get air. They can't get what they want. So you have to match or exceed their inspiratory flow. It's the first thing to help synchronize any patient is outdo their inspiratory flow. They'll settle down quickly. Because that's a terrible feeling to be able to suck in and only get part of the air you want when you can't breathe. Okay? So, back to this. It starts at 60. Once it gets down to, and it's calculated, start at 60, end at 24, over 1 second, blowing that fast, that much air, I'll end up with 500 tidal volume in that breath. Okay? So once it gets to the end of sucking in, or it, in this case, blowing in, it immediately releases the pressure, and they start exhaling out, okay? So immediately when you exhale out, the first part of the air that comes out of you is the fastest. And it slows down, all right? That's why it jumps straight down here. Say this is 60 on the expiratory flow. This is 60 coming out of the patient. So it starts and it gets here, and then the next breath, when the next breath starts, that is when this breath is complete. So this is what makes up one single breath. If you took somebody on a rate of 20, and if you divide 60 a minute by 20, you get 3 seconds. That means you've got to get this in and out in 3 seconds. As you know, we use eye time somewhere around 1 on most people. That's more normal than anything. So the rest of the time, in this case, if it was a rate of 20, the rest of the time would be 2 seconds, because we used one of the 3 there on this part. The rest of the time would be 2 seconds, and then the next breath would happen. They'd exhale it out for 2 seconds, the next breath. So in this case, this is the breath right here. Everything between there, it's made of the inspiratory and the expiratory. That's the only part you'll probably ever work with. There is a little variation. If it was to hold this person's breath, I'll do it here. Once it got the baseline, this baseline is no flow. That's when they're not blowing in or blowing out or sucking in. All right? So say it gets to the next breath here, it gets to baseline. If you had set the vent to hold their breath for half a second even, then they would exhale out. That actually is technically part of the breath too, but you don't use that in practice. We use that 1 in 1,000 people. The only reason we would use that is in some of the sickest people with oxygen issues. We make them hold their breath to help them oxygenate. Years ago we did it with a mode called pressure control, inverse ratio pressure control. And you had to paralyze them and sedate them heavily and all that because it's uncomfortable to go and do that over and over. So they wouldn't fight, we would do that. Now our ventilators have a new mode called bi-level. You may hear that. It's something you'll never use in a truck, I would hope. Your vent won't do it. But what that does is during that breath hold, it allows the patient to breathe on their own. Their lungs may be full when they do it because it's still in the inspiratory part of the breath. They haven't exhaled yet. So their lungs are full, but they can breathe while their lungs are full. A little bit of air, and that way they don't fight the machine, so we don't have to paralyze those people anymore. So bi-level is inverse pressure control, which we'll talk about pressure control, that lets them breathe spontaneously, okay? Only thing else I'm going to say about bi-level is it's one of the last modes that we use to help oxygenate a patient, because what oxygenates a patient, of course, everybody's always said separate ventilation, CO2, bicarb, pH, from the oxygen on the blood gas, and you deal with them differently. Oxygen, of course, the way to oxygenate is turn their oxygen up. That doesn't work. Anything else you change is designed to bring the mean airway pressure up. Just like a mean blood pressure, it's the average over time of the pressure in their lungs. By holding their breath, spending more time with their lungs full of pressure, it jacks that mean pressure up and opens their alveoli and they oxygenate better. So it's getting to where we're talking really sick people that we're having trouble oxygenating. Hopefully you would never need to do that. So that's part of a breath, but this is what we're working with today. This is all we need to talk about. We don't need to talk about breath holds or any of that when we describe each mode, okay? So that's the main part of a breath. That is, a machine breath. And if you can tell, ain't nobody sucking on this tube to make you breathe. So it's counting a rate of 8. When the time comes, I think it's 7.5 seconds or so, it decides, all right, it's time to give a breath. It is a time-cycled breath. No, let me rephrase that, a time-triggered breath. And we talk at the hospital and everywhere else does, they call modes by a lot of times they call the different breath types by what triggers the breath. So you may hear that. That's a time-triggered breath, but it's called a mandatory breath. That means the machine is mandating you're going to get this breath. All right? It's independent of what the patient does. In assist control, the only other type of breath that happens in assist control, and I'll show you here, I don't know how much this lung will take, but we're going to make it get big. All right. I want you to be able to see the difference. So it's breathing, if I don't touch it, 8 times a minute, 650 in each breath. That's what 650 looks like in this lung. If I'm the patient and I start to trigger a breath, it's going to give me the whole 750. It's going to blow it in like I have it set. I don't get to control any of that. All I get to control is I want another breath. All I have to do is barely trigger it, and it gives the whole breath, okay? That's why we use assist control on the sick people that we don't want working at all. That's why, in some cases, if you're ventilating them in a different mode, and they're having trouble in your bus, and you're headed to a hospital, and you need to do something, the first thing to do, if they're in a different mode, and I'll go over that, is sometimes switching to assist control. Make every breath a machine breath, so to speak. That way, all they have to do as far as work that they have to do, and they get as much ventilation as they want, almost, is all they got to do is trigger it. And triggering it is so easy. These vents use flow or pressure to trigger, and it's whichever they achieve first. If they suck a certain amount of pressure out of the circuit, it'll say you want a breath, and it'll give them a breath. And it's like 1 or 2, and this one it's, the sensitivity is 3 liters per minute. It's using flow sensitivity. That's the other version. And it'll trigger on flow quicker on this vent. It'll use pressure as a backup. You don't need to worry about that. But all they have to do is suck in to where 3 liters a minute is going into their tube, and the machine says you must want a breath, and in assist control, it gives them the whole breath. It says, all right, you want a breath, and it takes over completely. They do no work to get that breath. They don't stop the breath. They don't determine with their effort how much air's in it, anything. That's all determined by your settings and assist control. So the only difference in the breath type
Those other markers should work if you need them. The ones I just put up there.
Let me have a different
Oh,
color.
that's
All
us.
those, the ones I put up there, these are the.
Oh, okay. All right, I'll change
Oh,
them.
okay.
I'll switch over in a minute since I'm already doing this. Well, I'll do it now. That'll work.
These ones.
All right, so the black ones are when the machine decided it was time to give a breath, okay? If the patient determines it's time to give a breath, say that, we're on the red 8, say that 7.5 seconds has not happened yet, and the patient wants a breath in between, all they have to do is suck in
Really?
just enough to trigger. All right, I missed the joke, but
No, that stuff
More-
works.
That's all right. I'll go back to faithful black if I have to. Y'all can see that. All they have to do, the only difference is here, the machine immediately started blowing the air in. Here, they had to suck in just enough for the machine to sense that they wanted a breath, and then it delivers the exact same breath as the machine delivers. So the patient does virtually no work. All they have to do is a few on their own. If say they're on the rate of 8 and they're breathing 10 times a minute, the only work they have to do during the whole thing is twice during that minute, they're triggering a breath with a slight inspiratory effort, okay? So that's why if you get somebody in a different mode, like IMV or pressure support or CPAP, which we'll talk about, and they're air hungry, short of breath, working too hard, the first thing I would do would be to switch them to assist control. All right? And I was asked earlier a couple times about what to go over. And one of the things was, help us set the bin up so it's more like what you would do when we get there. And thinking and talking with some people about that, I think the best thing in that case is if it's not broke, don't fix it. All right, if you have a blood gas and they're comfortable, let them ride. I don't care if you think it's the crappiest settings there are. Now, if you're on a 900 tidal volume, then you might want to drop that so you don't pop their lung and you're using your really cool needle decompression kit I saw. That is awesome. We have a needle in a tube and we put it in some water, so y'all's is great. Anyway, so that's a change I would understand. That makes sense. If they're in what we call, and I'll go into detail, volume ventilation, stay in volume ventilation. You've got more control. I wouldn't, on the back of the ambulance, rarely would I ever think that I would switch from a volume mode to a pressure mode or vice versa. Even though we do pressure at the hospital, there's no need to switch it to pressure, so it's more like what we do when we get there. Because basically, then we're kind of blind. We don't have a blood gas to match. And what we use to match and to know where to go, we'll talk a little bit more about, but the most important thing for us is the minute ventilation that was happening on the ventilator when the blood gas was drawn. So if you get a blood gas from a hospital, make note of some of the basic settings, of course, but the important number to know is the minute ventilation. It's usually either MV or it's a V with a dot on it on your blood gas slip. And it's usually 8 liters a minute, 10 liters a minute. It's that kind of number. Because that's the amount of air they're moving out, in and out, every minute. And that's what you can correlate a blood gas to. You can say with about 10 liters a minute, their CO2 on the last gas was 48. So you know, if your minute ventilation is below 48, they're breathing less, their CO2 has to be a little higher. If your minute ventilation is a little higher than that, you can guesstimate or extrapolate or just get lucky, and their CO2 may be lower than that. So when you're adjusting the vent, when they're not doing well, you have a baseline to know they were doing fairly well. Say their gas is perfect, say it was 74039 CO2. You know, this is the amount of air in and out every minute that I need to have to get that CO2 right about where it needs to be to make them comfortable. And of course, minute ventilation is a combination of the rate times the tidal volume over a minute. So if you have that patient on 800 and they're on a rate of 10, they're getting about 8 liters a minute. Their blood gas is perfect, but you're worried about popping their lungs. So say you drop their tidal volume to 600. Now on a rate of 10, they're getting 6 liters a minute. Their ventilation went down, their CO2 went up. So what you would do would be to go up on their rate a little bit to compensate for that, okay? So minute ventilation is, you don't have to compare rate to rate, volume to volume. It's the combination of both. It's the best number to use when deciding which way to go with your settings. And we'll talk about that a little bit more.
So that's the first thing you want to know from us when we show up with the patient. You want to know
Well, it's the first thing I want to know when I see a blood gas from the previous hospital. What was their minute ventilation? And then while we're moving them up on the bed, I'm setting up the ventilator to mimic about that minute ventilation. And then, if they look comfortable there, I'll get a gas and start over, so to speak. If they don't look comfortable on that for some reason, then I would make adjustments. But if they had a good gas and a good minute ventilation, I would mimic that on my machine, maybe with less volume, so I'm not stretching, but I'd compensate. And if they had a bad blood gas, say they left Lincolnton or something, and their CO2 was 70, and their pH was 725, and their minute ventilation is 10, I would start with a minute ventilation of 12 or 13, because I know I need to bring it down. While we're on that, we don't usually ventilate for CO2. We ventilate for the pH. That accounts for all the people in this part of the world who have lung disease, which is more here than anywhere probably. Because your body will compensate for a high CO2 over time, and I'm not going to get into blood gas analysis or anything, but somebody with lung disease may have a perfect pH. They live.
That works.
They have a perfect normal pH between 7.35 and 7.45. They have a normal pH for them, and their CO2 can be 65. If my CO2 was 65 right now, I'd be panting, I'd be sweating, I'd be dying. I'd be dramatic, it'd be ugly. But over time, their body's gotten used to that. So their bicarb has gone up from the normal of, say, 22 to 26. This person's bicarb's probably about 34 to make that pH. So if you take this person and you ventilate them from a normal CO2 and bring their CO2 down to 35 or 40, their pH is going to go up, and they're going to be alkalotic. They're not used to having that gone from their blood. So we don't ventilate for the CO2, we ventilate for the pH. And so if you have a CO2 on the gas you're getting, don't worry about the CO2 as long as the pH is good. If the pH is bad, then you can worry about CO2. Yeah, man.
We had one last week or so that their initial gas was like 99, and we got them, they were like 80, 82, and we did make some little adjustments to try to fix that.
It's probably great.
It wasn't a COPD patient.
Well, and there are COPD patients whose CO2s are that high. There's not that many. Usually they've passed away by then. But I had a patient who would eat chocolate kisses all day long, laying in the bed. It was covered in chocolate, little silver things all over his body, and his CO2 was 110 when he had a normal pH. I mean, it was amazing. He was alert, awake, shoving chocolate in his mouth all day long. But anyway, so that's probably okay. I can't say for sure unless I know the pH. If you get that patient, you got to look at them together, because that's the only thing that tells you if it's normal for them.
I think that one was like 727 or something like that.
So he probably lives about 65, 75, maybe 80 on his CO2. So you were doing him a favor if it's that. If his pH is off, then his CO2, if his pH is low, then his CO2 needs to come down to correct it. Now there are some cases with metabolic problems where the CO2 can be normal and the PO2 can be acidotic, but still, we drop the CO2 to help those patients not breathe as hard. And I'll go into detail on some of that, how it affects breathing, how different CO2s for different patients affects breathing, and some tricks you can do to get them under control when they're working real hard by tricking their body, making them think that they're breathing great. When they're not, they settle down, and then you can adjust them in. You can't necessarily do it when they're working hard. They're fighting. So there's a way to calm them out without knocking them out. All right, so that's assist control, basically. That's the breath pattern for assist control. All right, and we're going to talk about pressure and volume control in a little bit, but not yet. Just to say a few words, the difference is volume ventilation delivers a set volume with a set flow in. This is assist control. You can have assist control VC. That's assist control, volume control. All right. The control part in this is what ends the breath. That determines what type of breath it is. All right, there's the breath pattern, which determines the mode, and then the kind of breaths that are in the pattern are pressure control, volume control, pressure support. Those are breath types. So you mix the pattern with the breath type, and that gives you what we call modes of ventilation. Because technically the modes assist control, but we don't say that. I report to the next person there on assist control, pressure control. And even though the pressure control is the breath type, it's not part of the mode. It's still listed in the name so they know what they're doing. All right. So that is assist control. Next, let's go over real quick SIMV, because I'm going to out. SIMV for years was used by all the hospitals. At one point, it may have been the most common mode. We used to have a backwards way of thinking that everybody who got put on the vent lost the strength to breathe within a day or two. Their muscles fatigued, and we had to retrain their muscles. We've since learned that that's all not true.
You can say crap.
Okay.
It's all right.
And I did it for years long with all sorts of other hospitals. We thought that was the best way to wean somebody off the vent. And it's crap, excuse me. We now realize that unless you have either really weak respiratory muscles from lung disease and from working hard every day, or you're on the vent for weeks to where you, on a mode like this that requires you to do no real effort to get your breath, then you start having muscle atrophy and fatigue, and then you do have to start training these people to strengthen their breathing muscles. That happens now at places like Select and places that are long-term vent units. We don't do that in ICU. If they're in ICU on the vent, and it shouldn't affect y'all ever, if they're in ICU on the vent and they're to the point where they've lost muscle weakness, and we can do some things to tell, that's when they go to like intermediate or pulmonary and ride the vent up there, and we slowly wean them. And SIMV, in our opinion, we use it for slow weaning long-term vents. You can use it occasionally, we don't, but some hospitals use it occasionally because they think it lets the patient synchronize better with the ventilator. And I'll explain why that is in a minute when I'm explaining the mode. But in my opinion, it's incorrect. So you're going to see a lot of people coming from other hospitals, I'm imagining, on SIMV. And if you have a better understanding on what that is, it'll help you know what to do to fix it if they don't look good on SIMV. Okay, so SIMV, same thing here. Do black. Same as the last waveform. This is pressure. This is time. I'm going to stretch it out a little bit so I can a little better. All right, and that's time going this way. So the breath pattern, which makes it a mode and gives it the name of a mode. SIMV stands for their first was, and you may even see this or hear this, IMV without the S, and that's intermittent mandatory ventilation. All right. Remember, these are mandatory vent breaths. Even if the patient triggered it, it's mandatory. What makes a mandatory breath on a ventilator in any mode, any hospital, anywhere? Let me change that. Go backwards to this. There's mandatory. There's spontaneous. A spontaneous breath has to be triggered and started by the patient, and it has to be ended by the patient. Okay? So if we say that's a patient-triggered breath, that still can be a mandatory breath. All the patient did was trigger it. They didn't start the breath and do something that indicated to end the breath. Okay? So to be a spontaneous breath, you have to start it and stop it. Everything else, any other combination, patient started, ventilator stopped it. Ventilator started it, but patient stopped it. Anything else like that is always a mandatory breath. Okay? So basically, the patient controls when they get the breath on a spontaneous breath and how much they get and when it stops. In an assist control breath or a mandatory breath, they control none of that. Okay? And so what makes that important is on SIMV, which is on SIMV now, that's cool. The machine, you set the same exact thing pretty much. You set a backup or a set rate. Say we set it at 8. That means every 7.5 seconds, they're going to get a machine breath, what we call a machine breath or a mandatory breath. If the patient lays there like they're not on a log, they're sedated or they're dead or whatever, and they don't breathe, they're going to get 8 breaths given by the machine where it dictates everything. It's exact as assist control. What's different about it is when they breathe on their own, on assist control, they trigger the breath, they get a full machine breath. On IMV, which we now call SIMV, IMV is intermittent mandatory ventilation. We put the S in front of it because with computers and vents, they're smart enough now that at 7.5 seconds, it's going to give another breath no matter what happens. And we can kind of tweak the timing, but at 7.25, right before that next breath is supposed to be given, if the patient takes a breath, it counts that as the machine breath, and it gives them a full breath. And the reason you do that is, as I'm going to draw it up here, you don't want the patient starting a breath and then the machine giving them a breath right behind it and stacking breaths. So it eliminates double breaths or stacking, or it does what it says. It synchronizes with the patient, so they're not exhaling when the next one shoves in their throat or the other way around. Okay? So, on IMV, you have 8 breaths a minute. Machine starts out, gives a breath, lets them exhale, and then say here's the next 7.5 minute mark. That's when the next breath is going to be delivered by the machine. Say the patient's breathing 14 times a minute. Those other 6 breaths are going to be spontaneous breaths, which means in IMV, they start when it happens and they stop when it ends, which is unlike any of the breaths we've talked about before. So the patient may start the breath, and it looks a little different than a machine breath. And then it ends, and they exhale. And so they get another breath, it ends, and then they exhale. And then they're not trying to breathe here at that mark. The machine's going to give them another machine breath. Okay? So in between machine breaths on IMV, they can take a breath with as much air in it as they want. They can start it, stop it anytime, and they can dictate how much is in it. What dictates how much is in this breath and this breath, any of them, especially in these breaths, what dictates it is the amount you dial in, the tidal volume. That's pretty much it. In volume ventilation, if you want 500, it's going to give them 500. There are some things that changes based on their lung stiffness. If their lungs are really stiff, you'll get your 500, and this is why people like this mode. If, say, I'm on the vent for 2 hours, and I'm in CHF, and I'm not real stiff to begin with, and I'm on this mode up here, it's going to give me 500. The peak pressure on the vent, which is going to be measured here, varies because the volume is constant. How fast I'm blowing it in is set and constant. The only variable is how much air comes out when I exhale. And that's based on how stiff my lungs are and somewhat how closed my airways are. Okay? So the pressure varies on this one. All right? And we'll talk more about that when we talk about breath types. But on a spontaneous breath, what dictates how much air is under those, or how much they get in exhale for those breaths on IMV, is how hard they suck in. If they suck in really hard, they'll get a big breath. If they barely suck in, they'll get a small breath. Now, there is something called pressure support, and we can assist with how much they do on these breaths. And I'll explain that a little bit better in a minute. But since we don't use that much, most people put like a pressure support of 5 or 10, just so they get some air, enough to overcome breathing through the circuit, through the tube, because if there was no support through this, it's hard work breathing through an ET tube and breathing through a vent circuit. There's a lot of resistance to the air. So we dial in, when we do use this, we dial in a little bit of pressure support. Pressure support doesn't tell them when to start or when to stop, so it's still spontaneous, but it helps them breathe more. If I suck in on a spontaneous breath, this is a flow waveform. If this was pressure on this breath, the pressure would be like that. This could be 30 of pressure, all right? On a spontaneous breath, at first it's negative pressure, then it's positive pressure, and then they exhale. And what I mean by that is on a machine, a spontaneous breath, the patient sucks in. The air's going in because they're sucking it in. So it's a negative pressure in the circuit. It's not a positive pressure. Once they slow their effort and stop their effort sucking in, if there was no pressure support, that would be the end of the breath, all right? With pressure support, when they stop sucking in, it says, all right, you're done. Then the circuit, it keeps blowing until the pressure goes from negative pressure to positive pressure of whatever you set. By doing that, it tacks on a little bit of extra air to their spontaneous effort to make a weak effort a little better, to make a weak effort help get through the tubing because that's hard to breathe through. All right, so that's the difference between the two main modes, all right? What's it doing?
High pressure.
Oh, okay.
Somewhere.
See if we can dial that back. That'll help maybe a
Take
little.
the line for that one crack.
Yeah.
Should be.
All right, so that's assist control, that's IMB. The reason it's good to change to assist control, if I'm on IMB and I'm working hard, I'm getting 8 breaths a minute where the machine is doing all the work. So I don't have to do anything but just make it start. But on the other breaths, I actually have to suck negative pressure through the circuit. I have to make that circuit pressure drop for air to come to me. So I'm working on these breaths. That's why we used it to wean people. We would let them make sure they were getting enough every minute that they didn't get in trouble, but we made them work their muscles, okay? The people you get are really, really sick. Why would you want them to let them use their muscles? We don't do that. Now the way we treat vets in the ER, in the ICU is we come in, we put them on full support. We get blood gases, we make sure their CO2 is good, their PO2 is good, the pH is good, and then we leave them alone. And every morning we do spontaneous awakening trials to take them off their drugs as much as possible, make sure their head's together. And then we do spontaneous breathing trials. We take them from this to the next mode I'm getting ready to talk about. Somebody drew with a Sharpie, did they? I've done that a lot. All right, so the last mode we'll talk about, or breath pattern, is CPAP. CPAP can also be pressure support. So it's CPAP with pressure support. It's essentially what BiPAP is, and I'll explain it a little bit in a second. But this is the same as the other, and I'll move my head in just a minute. Time, and this is flow, all right? So on pressure support, there are no breaths that are given by the patient or by the machine. Unless they go apneic, it senses, hey, you ain't breathed in 20 minutes, it will kick into this to save your patient from dying. But other than that, what it does is it's all these kind of breaths. It's all spontaneous triggered and spontaneous stopped breaths. So the patient basically dictates, that's crude, but it dictates how fast they breathe. It dictates when each breath starts and when each breath stops. And what I mean by when the breath stops, on pressure support, as long as you're sucking in, this will keep going. You suck in 2 seconds, it'll go 2 seconds. Once you stop sucking in, that extra little pressure support that you dialed in quickly reaches that number, and that's what ends the breath. It's ended because you quit sucking in. All right? So a pressure-supported breath can have a big volume, a lot under the curve, or it can have a little bit, and that depends on how hard the patient's sucking in. So that's the last mode, CPAP. And if you did that without pressure support at all, you'd still have flow going in and flow coming out, but the pressure in the circuit would never increase. So they would basically be breathing through a straw, and they have to do all the work. Okay? So that's why when we're weaning, we always add at least 5 of pressure support to overcome the circuit and the work of that. So you should never have somebody on a mode, and in your case it'd be IMB, where the spontaneous breaths in, if you have them on IMB, you need to have some form of pressure support dialed in as well. Because without it, you're making their spontaneous breaths they're taking incredibly hard for a really sick person. Because y'all don't transport people who aren't sick. So I would never have IMV. If I have an IMV patient that you get, at least make sure there's some pressure support setting dialed in. If they're doing bad, don't bother with trying to increase the pressure support to take the work away from their spontaneous breath and relieve their work of breathing that way. Switch them to assist control. Let the machine do everything. Because if you go up to 15, it's doing more of the work, but you don't know that it's doing 100%. You're still having to suck in to get it going and all that. So, in y'all's case, the safest thing to do is if I'm in SIMB, 500 tidal volume, rate of 8, say I've even got 15 of pressure support dialed in on the spontaneous breath, so they're getting a good bit of help. If they're still air hungry, switch them to assist control. Stay in volume, or stay in pressure if that's what you're in, but switch to volume, okay? Never transport anybody in CPAP. The only time I can see that, they'll do that. The only time they'll do that is if you've got somebody who's big time wheezing. They want to let them control the start and the stop, because those people, when they exhale forever before it gets to where there's no air coming out. All right? So if you put, I mean, this could be 10 seconds. That don't leave a lot of time to have a high rate, and they need a lot of air movement. So in this case, most of the time, you're going to need to sedate them some so you can work with them. You may want to think about that and leave them, use as low a rate as you can get by with, because they need as much exhalation time as possible. But some places will put them in CPAP pressure support, let them determine their own rate. And when they do that, they end up doing all right for a minute, and then they drop their rate to 6 or something so they can exhale, and then they're acidotic. So I would switch. I'd say, thank you for letting me have this patient. The minute y'all leave, change it out of CPAP PSV. It was not a safe mode to transport. They're going to work and work and work until something bad happens. So I would transport them in this if they're comfortable. If they're not comfortable in IMB, volume, switch them to assist control, PC if you have to. I mean, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. If they're in SIMB, BC, which is this, with every machine breath being a volume breath, switch them to assist control, where every machine breath is the same tidal volume that was set here. You don't have to adjust that. That'll take away almost every bit of their work, all right? So then there's not much else. There's a few other things you can do if they're not settled down, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's the biggest and the most helpful thing you can do is get them out of IMB if they're in that. If they're in that and happy, bring them on. If they're not happy, switch to this. Don't do that. That'll be laughed at. So, all right.
Now that CPAP, you saying CPAP with the,
Like a vented.
On the vent.
what's the difference between that and BiPAP?
Very little. Very little. That's what I was saying a second ago. That is essentially the breath pattern of BiPAP, but they're doing it through a mask. You can't switch them out of that on a mask into something like this, because when you do, all you're going to do is inflate their cheeks, inflate the mask. The machine's going to ramp up to that peak pressure, and they're not going to get any volume. Every ventilator in the world will do its best to deliver the volume you put in. But if it doesn't get that whole volume in before the pressure gets too high, the pressure limit, it'll stop that breath at that pressure limit and let them exhale. So if you're constantly alarming high pressure, they're not getting the whole number you set. They're getting some form lower. And I don't know, does this show exhale tidal volume somewhere? Yeah, up top. You'll see they're on 425, but they're really getting 300, and it's alarming high peak pressures. You know it's reaching that peak pressure before it's reaching that delivered volume. That's not going to work. But in CPAP, that's what BiPAP is. That's actually why y'all's machine is, like we talked about a little bit ago, off by 5. On a BiPAP Vision or a V60 or an ST, any of the regular, only thing they do is BiPAP machines at hospitals. When they have somebody on 20 over 5, that's 20 of IPAP, it's 5 of CPAP. And what that means is on a pressure waveform, this is flow, they're going to stay at 5 when they exhale. Their pressure is going to, when they exhale, it's going to hold 5 in their lungs at all times to hold their lungs open. And in a lot of cases, which is where it started with sleep apnea, that bottom number is a lot higher because it's used to stent their airway open. But in somebody breathing in distress, you're not doing it for that. So we don't use the same numbers as you would with that. We use it more for holding their alveoli open. So every breath when they exhale, their alveoli don't slam shut, and then we got to pop them open on the next breath. So they tend to oxygenate better. But your 20 of inspiratory pressure, so it's running along at 5, and then he wants to take a breath. In BiPAP, he starts the breath and he ends the breath. He plays a big part in how much air he gets with each breath. But the machine, just like the pressure-supported breaths, augments those breaths with some pressure so they don't have to do all the work, okay? So in BiPAP, and this is a pressure, that's flow, it basically kind of does the same thing. And then it lets them exhale and they come back to the 5. This line here is 0 pressure. They come back to the 5 of pressure on exhalation. So on all the BiPAP machines around the world that are BiPAP only, this number is 20 and this number is 5, okay? This one is 0. Y'all can see that. So when I sat on a BiPAP machine in the hospital, 20 over 5, the peak pressure is going to be 20. And expiratory pressure, like it is now, is going to stay at 5. All right, on these machines I've learned, and we have transport I-vents that we used to transport. I think we put them in the bus with you guys a few times, taking somebody long-term maybe. We may have just used yours. They do the same as yours, which instead of, in this case, the difference between the 5 and 15 is what we call the delta P. It's the change in pressure. It's how much pressure when they breathe is applied to their lungs is only 15 more than where they were to begin with. All right, so they're getting 15 of help when they breathe in. That's like having a 15 pressure support on a vent mode, okay? On our machines, it's like this. On your machines, when you dial in 20 of IPAP or whatever you were saying that they call it on this one,
When you dial in your pressure support, which is your eye.
yeah, and that's the key. If it's called pressure support, it is above the PEEP. It means you add it to the PEEP.
That's what they would say.
If it's called IPAP, you subtract the PEEP out of it, and either one of those gives you what pressure is applied when they breathe in. So on yours, if you dial 20 in, that's 20 right there. They go all the way up to 25 because what you added is 20 of PSV. So you're going to peak at 25. So if you get somebody on 20 over 5 and they're on a BiPAP machine at the hospital, you're going to set yours, if you want to do the exact same, at what?
15 over 5.
15 over 5.
So you just subtract your P from your eye, whatever the I is, and that should give you what they're on.
Yes.
An eye machine.
Does that make sense?
That's if they're on BiPAP.
That's their own BiPAP.
Okay. BiPAP to hospital, we would drop it on hours.
You just subtract
So
the
if the
P
peep,
from your.
so if the
from
peep was
eye.
8
From
or
your
out of
eye.
time,
Huh?
the peep was 8 and the I, or the pressure support was 20.
They would peak
We
at
do 12
28.
over, then we would do 12 over 8.
We would do 12 over.
So
So
we-
you're
Like,
always,
we would add it.
if
If
they
they
had
had
it at 20 over 8 there, we walked in
Just
and they
subtract
were 20 over
the
8.
Subtract
We
your
would set
E
it at
from
12.
your
You
eye.
want the
That's what
you,
you're
yeah, you want the same delta
They,
P, and
they
that's what
just
she's
don't learn
saying.
about it. We
So
would've
the
told
delta
her
P
they
is
were
the
on
change in
BiPAP.
pressure from exhalation to inspiration. So that if they were on 8, if they're on 20 over 8 at the hospital on a BiPAP machine, if you dialed in 20 over 8 on yours, 20 of the PSV, and an 8 of CPAP, you're going to come out at 28. So what you would do would be, like she said, you would dial in 12 of PSV and 8 of PEEP. I think it calls it PEEP on your machine. But
These pictures
it's the delta P that needs to be the
Very
same.
uncomfortable.
So it's the delta P that needs to be the same. So when you get to the hospital and you pass them off to us, that's when it's really hard because it goes the other direction. When y'all pick them up and they say 20 over 5, if y'all put 20 in as PSV and 5 of EPAP, they're getting a little bit bigger breath with you. So it may be uncomfortable for them, it may feel different, but respiratory-wise, it may not decompensate them. But then when we get them, if we're told they're on 20 over 5, We've lost 8 of pressure or 5 of extra pressure. We put them on and they're air hungry.
So when we took my BiPAP patient yesterday from Lexington to Versailles,
Yeah.
and she was,
Where was that? Which
Well,
ICU was that?
she went through in 270.
Yeah, ICU 3. Lori was there.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. She was, I can't even remember her settings right now, but because, so she went from 91% of Lexington to 98, 99% with us.
You were giving her bigger breasts.
She was really good, because she calmed down a ton. I was like, what did I
Yeah.
do wrong? Because she is so relaxed right now, and her sat has come up like,
You helped her. You gave her a lot more air each breath.
but
They
I
were-
didn't want to do that.
No, it was
No,
fine.
that's
It
fine.
was
But
it
wasn't.
But some people aren't.
No.
Like, that's why a lot of them
If
don't
they do
tolerate it. 'Cause they're like,
okay.
She's right. She's right. You don't want to do that if you don't know you're doing it and they don't need it.
Yeah.
If they need it,
So
increasing their
since she
inspiratory is
calmed
great.
down,
Mhm.
she's okay.
Yeah, she was
so
fine.
if she continued to be anxious
After you put her on with your
after I
settings,
put her on with the adjusted settings,
okay, then you would do what you did.
then we would increase
Yeah.
like we did.
Yeah, because
Okay.
most patients, and
Because
talk-
I was like, what did I
Yeah.
do wrong? We
you
really
made that
fixed
first
her.
step of fixing her shortness of breath that she didn't realize she had until after she felt better from you helping her.
Okay.
But that's in BiPAP. There's very little you can do. You can change a few things, but the main thing you would do with somebody who is air hungry or still tachypnic or working hard, any of those things, in BiPAP is you would increase their inspiratory pressure. Now I don't know, and this has been we've talked. I don't know what guidelines y'all work under. I don't know what limits. We have some limits. So in our situation, just from the science, we never put anybody with more of an inspiratory pressure than total peak pressure of 25 through a mask, because then you're forcing air down their esophagus, and you're more likely to puke in it. We really, if it's not working at 20 over something, that's when we start thinking about intubating them for sure, because anything over 25 has proven in some people to put air in their stomach, and then you got a whole nasty other issue.
To be honest, I have rarely seen anybody that's over 16, maybe 18 is the highest I've seen. But
Okay, good.
I've seen some 20.
But yeah, our policy does not have a max on
It
it.
doesn't have a
It
max.
has a start and does not have a
Well,
max.
and in that case, I would follow the guidelines that we have, and the reason I say that is because they were based on studies that show that you're going to start putting gastric
Over 20.
distension with technically over 25. We cautiously stay under 25 and don't like to get over 20 without it's time to intubate them. But 20 is where we try to stop, 25 is where we have to stop. So in using that, if you've got an air-hungry patient who's on 16 over 5 and they're still breathing 30 times a minute, start going up on that iPad. Don't get up into the 20s. I mean, stop at 20, 22, because to be honest, if 20 or 22 ain't working, 25 ain't going to make a difference. And it gets risky. You're getting close to that line. So
Now, do you adjust the PEEP at all? If the PEEP doesn't really
we
have
don't.
much to do
I would
with
not
it. It's more
adjust.
the
We'll go ahead and talk
pressure
about BiPAP. This is awesome. We'll get this over with. You don't adjust. We don't adjust PEEP on BiPAP for any kind of work of breathing problems. The only thing you adjust for tachypnic, I'm working too hard, I'm even retracting, which is pretty bad in an adult, or they're sweaty and can't hold still, and you know it's because they're uncomfortable with the respiratory rate. IPAP is what fixes that. IPAP also fixes blood gas-wise CO2. You go up on the IPAP, you can in general think that you're going down on CO2 towards fixing your pH, is what we talked about as your target. You do adjust EPAP on patients, and it can become relevant for you guys. The only thing in general, occasionally we'll do it for the asthmatic, just to stent their airways open to let them exhale more, but that's not something in your arena you're going to be able to do, because that takes adjusting it, drawing gases, looking at stuff, and y'all don't do that. So the only time y'all would ever in BiPAP adjust the EPAP, or in your case I think it's called PEEP, the setting, is oxygen. And we do, and this is what I talked about, decided I would, and y'all can tell me if you decide this, we have a PEEP chart. If I'm going up on somebody's O2 and I get to 60, I need to have the PEEP at 8, for instance. If I get up to 80, I need to have it at 10. And so we do them this way, all right? I wouldn't do that in an emergency or in the back of the bus. And we do that to use the lowest FiO2 possible, but we're talking long-term, and FiO2 long-term makes the tissue of the lung brittle. So we like to keep everything under 60 if at all possible. In your case, you're trying to keep them alive from here to there. Go up on the oxygen first until you've maxed out your oxygen, and then start working on the PEEP, okay? If you brought me a patient who's on 5 a PEEP and 90%, and their SAT was 92, I thought you did awesome. I wouldn't expect you to bring somebody on, well, he's on 80%, so I went up to 12.5 a PEEP. Problem with that is you've got a max pressure on BiPAP you can use before you start blowing air into their stomach. So the higher you go up on that low number, the less room you have left to assist their inspiratory effort, okay? So I don't go up in a transport situation. I would not go up on EPAP unless I'm on 100% and their SATs weren't adequate.
And you consider inadequate to be
Well,
below.
it's relative, and what I mean by that is, in general, if they have COPD, if they've got digital clubbing and all that, they can tolerate a little SO2, all right? And I'm not saying as far as tolerating it to live. Everything I'm telling you is based on work of breathing, and what I mean by that is most people, if me, who has a normal CO2 and a normal pH and a normal O2, if my PO2 is normally 80 and then it's down to 68, my body knows that. I work hard. On the other side, if my CO2, say it's 40, if it goes up to 47, I work hard. People with lung disease who are used to a 60 PO2, if it goes down to 60, they don't respond to that anymore. There are receptors in their large vessels that regulate that. It's like a thermostat. If the number goes down, the heat kicks on. In this case, their thermostat is dull. So if their oxygen drops a little lower than their normal, they don't kick in and drive real hard. So when somebody with COPD and they oxygen at home, and you can real quickly decide if oxygen is bad for them. Some COPD people oxygenate well, but it's their CO2 that's over time tearing them up. If they got digital clubbing, or if they use oxygen at home, or any of that, 88, I wouldn't do much more than 88. And what I mean by that is, I'd get them up to 90 or 92 if the only thing I'm changing is their oxygen percent. If I get to 100 and they're 88, I don't think I'm going to start increasing their EPAP to improve their oxygen anymore in that patient unless it's clinically indicated by how they looked, meaning he's still working hard. If he looks happy and his SAT's 88 and I'm on 100 but only 5 a PEEP, I'm staying on 105 a PEEP. If he's working hard, I might go up and try to get his SAT 92 because I want to eliminate anything that can make him drive harder. And there's only the two things. There's only oxygen and CO2 in real life. There's a few things that they teach you, lung stretch receptors and all that. That doesn't mean anything here. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but what you can do to make your patient happy and relaxed on the ventilator is trick their body, and it ain't really tricking it, it's doing it, but get their PO2 where they're happy, where they're not driven by that, and get their CO2 where they're not driven by that. And you can tell that without doing blood gases by their look, and we'll talk about that. There's one trick that I want you guys to think about maybe doing that we do in the hospital, and it's becoming more and more prevalent, and I'll explain that in a minute, but it's been invaluable, and I had to show every single one of the pulmonologists, I had to drag them in the room and show them this before they would agree and let me do this, but it works great.
Damn people.
All right, so that's basically BiPAP. So just be mindful that if you get it from another hospital, the way you know you can make it be perfect and match is match their peak pressure. If they're on their BiPAP machine and they say, oh, I'm on 20 over 5, just ask them, is that a peak pressure of 20 then? Or, because they may be on like our transport vents, they work like yours. If I say I'm on 20 over 5, I'm peaking at 25 on their transport vent. So to know if you have to change it and compensate with your settings, ask them what their peak pressure is. If their EPAP's 5 and their peak pressure is 20, that's 15 difference. You have to set 15 in your pressure support. If they say, I'm on 20 over 5, what's your peak pressure? 25, you know they're doing it like you do, and you don't have to do anything different. You set it just like theirs, okay? So the easy way is to ask what their peak pressure is, because 20 on top of 5 is 25, 20 with the 5 already included, like our BiPAP machines, the peak is 20. So you can gauge which way their machine is working by their peak pressure and what they say their IPAP is set at. Okay?
Is there the most minimum setting, like, you've tried them on a mask or something and you're gonna try BiPAP, but it's almost, because there's been times I've taken patients to ICU and they're like, why are they even on BiPAP?
Yeah.
Because of the settings.
Yeah.
Like, what?
And the most of the time, we wouldn't fault you guys at all. Either y'all did really good on the way over there and the patient improved. Not y'all doing good, but the patient improved. Or they may not have really needed it before, but it's not a reflection on you guys when we say that. We start trying to wean people off BiPAP when they get down to like 10 or 12 over 5. We never drop the EPAP below 5. All right? We just don't. It helps hold the alveoli open. So we leave the EPAP at 5 all the way to when we take them off. So all we're weaning is the support we're giving them. The support is the IPAP. That's what supports each breath. That's what makes the breaths. They don't look like this, they're not like this. But the IPAP is what it is trying to deliver when it gives a breath on BiPAP. So if I've got the IPAP down to 10 or 12, that's not a lot more help than just breathing through the system. So chances are, if you take them off, the next step down from 12 or 10 is off.
Yeah.
So if you bring somebody on 12 or 10 or even up to 15, there's a good chance we'll turn them off because that's the next logical step down in weaning.
So in triaging a patient, just to kind of put all this picture together, if we're getting someone from Thomasville or Lexington, they're like, yeah, they're 12 over 5, but they're breathing 30 times a minute and their SAT's 92%. You already have in your mind that you're probably going to be going up on the IPAP.
Exactly, yeah.
Because that's just so
Based
I can,
on the 30
just
breaths
so
a
I
minute.
can, when I'm triaging and reading these numbers, it helps to put that picture
And I
together,
would think
so I already know what I'm thinking.
I would think the exact same way. And the piece that they told me that made me think that is the 30 breaths a minute. 92 I'm fine with.
Right.
And the
It's
IPAP
more
has,
work.
and the IPAP barely ever influences oxygen. The only time ventilation improves or takes away from your stat or your oxygen is when it's too much ventilation or not enough ventilation. If I got somebody and I drop their inspiratory pressure or their tidal volume on the vent when they're in volume mode too low, if I don't get the air into those air sacs, the blood's going to come through, go around that alveoli, come out the other side with no air, with no interaction, no oxygen. Their sats are low. So if I have at least a minimal ventilation, where I'm getting fresh air in there, and I'm holding everything open, then they're going to oxygenate the best they can based on that. The only thing that's going to help is increasing how much I'm opening them up with PEEP. So you don't use IPAP ever to work on fixing an oxygen problem unless their tidal volumes are, if their SAT's 80, they're on 100%, and their tidal volume's 200, yeah, I would try to improve their tidal volume first to bring up their oxygen. It's the only time that that's used for that, is if they're hypoventilated. You're not getting enough air in and out. Once you get to where you've got that tidal volume to a normal thing, going up any farther is not going to help. So just lack of ventilation affects oxygen, but adequate or too much ventilation has nothing to do with oxygen. So same patient, breathing 30 times a minute, SAT's 85, I would go up on their oxygen. If they're already on 100, then I would have to think about going up on their EPAP now. Now think about this. I go up on their EPAP to 10, but I don't change the IPAP and make sure that I kept the same. Now I've cut their inspiratory help by 5. So if I'm on 15, do it on your vent and make it easy. If I'm on 15 over 5, and their SATs are terrible on 100, I'll go up to 15 over 10 on yours because yours is on top of that peak. They're going to be peaking at 25. You kept what I said was the delta P to help with the inspiratory part the same. If you do it on the other systems, like our machines, and they're on 20/5. If you increase their EPAP to 10, now they're on 20/10. They're only getting, they were getting 15 of a change in pressure, now they're getting 10. We have to compensate with the IPAP if we change our EPAP to keep the help with each breath the same. Your machine, you don't have to do that because you've dialed in that. You're setting the help you're giving them, not the total pressure. We set the total pressure, not the help. So we have to adjust it. So if you're adjusting your EPAP, you don't need to worry about changing your IPAP. It's going to stay the same. That's one good thing about this. But if you're at a BiPAP machine, if I go up on the EPAP, I took that out of my IPAP, they're going to have less tidal volumes. I need to adjust. So for that case, it's better. But if 100 ain't doing it, start going up on the EPAP. And then, of course, in BiPAP, if they're really satin low, even after that, there's not much else you can do. Maybe intubate them, or maybe take them off and mask bag them if you don't got far to go, and you don't want to intubate them, they're awake and all that, because when you manually ventilate somebody with a bag, even though I hate to say it and I know it's true and I try to avoid it, you use much larger volumes. There's less dead space, and that's a whole different ball game, but they get more of the fresh air deeper in their lungs. On a vent, you've got to overcome some of the circuit and all that, which is rebreathed air. So you may get a bump in their oxygen by bagging them with a mask. It always seems to work better than any machine in the world. But at that point, you need to figure intubating. You know, if you can't oxygenate them on maxed out BiPAP and 100%. And I wouldn't go over about 10, maybe 12 if I'm on EPAP if I'm trying to improve their oxygen. Anything past that, you're going to be putting too much air in their belly, because to ventilate them, the other numbers got to move, the whole peak pressure moves, and you're filling their belly as well. So, and the higher EPAPs also open up their esophagus. The esophagus stays closed, but if you get to a certain amount of pressure, it holds it open. So the more EPAP helps get to that number. So if I'm not oxygenating at those settings, I'm going to intubate them at that point. All right? All right,
It
so
seems to some people, like if they're doing well, we take them in there and they take it off and using just a high pressure nasal cannulas nowadays.
right. And if you want to explore taking somebody off in the ambulance, say you got another hour to go, I don't know the distance you travel, but I'm sure there's some that are long. And you get a patient and then you think, well, he's only on 14/5, he's only on 30%, and his SATs are 95 and he's not breathing hard. Take him off and try him.
Put them on a cannula.
And try him, you know.
Does it need to be that high pressure?
No. No, you would put them on a higher flow if they were on higher FO2s. If they're on 80 or something, I'd probably set up either a non-rebreather or a base tent with a high FO2. But if they're on, put it this way, every liter on a cannula is about 4%. So you can kind of do the math. And that changes when the patient breathes. If I'm sucking in real hard, it's not going to be 4%. Or it's not going to be 4% with each liter because I'm sucking in room air around it. That's the same with a non-rebreather. If you ever have somebody on a non-rebreather, make sure your tank is turned all the way up, not just 15, as high as you can get it. If they're on the truck, the flow meter, it stops measuring at 15, doesn't it? On y'all's trucks, flow meters.
Yeah, I think so.
If you keep turning, it'll go higher. It just won't measure higher. And I see this more than any mistake ever made by therapists, by nurses, by everybody. They put them on a non-rebreather at 10 liters or 15 liters. Well, the patient's air hungry. So they're sucking in. The average person resting, their inspiratory flow is close to 20 liters a minute. So if you think about it, I got them on a 15 liters a minute mask, and I'm sucking in 20. Y'all know as well as I do, that extra 5 does not come out of those flimsy, cheap bags. It comes in from the path of least resistance, all the big holes in the mask. Those bags mean nothing on non-rebreathers anymore. I'm going off on a tangent, but it's bothering me.
Well, I've heard that. I've heard it because
Yeah.
sometimes you can dial it down a little bit unless they're collapsing that bag.
And they'll
You're not
never
hurting
collapse the bag. You'll never see them collapse the bag now. Non-rebreathers, when they were made, were airtight seals. And they had 2 valves on each side. If you notice now, there's only 1 valve with 6 holes. The mask is a generic disposable. It doesn't fit my big nose like it might fit your nice little nose. It fits people different. So there's always air holes. So, and that bag, if I suck in air more than the flow from the wall is coming in, I'm going to get air through these big gaping holes in the mask. I'm not going to draw it out of this bag. So if you don't have the flow exceeding what they're sucking in, you're not on 100%. The only way to know is to have the flow as high as you can get it, period. Then the air is blowing out here extra when they're sucking in. Then you know they're on 100%. So if you ever get somebody on a non-rebreather on 10 or 15, what I tell people is turn the flow meter till you can hear it from the door. When you can hear that from the door, you know it's blowing hard enough. Those things will put out in the hospital up to like 45, 50 liters a minute. They only measure to 15. And we crank them because, and I do that with the ambu bags too, just so it doesn't exceed the reservoir on the bag. Now the reservoir on the bag is a closed system. It does draw. You ever see the bags with the bag on it, the ambu bags? They do actually go in and out if you don't have an adequate flow. Non-rebreathers don't. Non-rebreather, just crank it as high as you can. You're always better off.
And once again, if they're fine on the BiPAP and they're doing okay, just leave them on it.
You can leave them on
Unless
that. You're
they're
talking
on
about
some
the lower
ridiculous-
settings?
Yeah, no, if they're like on 12/4, then there's, I mean, we just put them on a
Yeah,
candle
if they're on
and
low
stuff.
settings like that and clinically, which I'll be straight up, in that kind of situation, nobody's better at clinically judging what their patient looks like than you do. Y'all have to do it in a bus. You have to do it in a hurry. Y'all have less stuff to help you like we do in the hospital. So use that to your advantage and use your judgment. If they're on minimal settings and fairly low O2, and what I mean by that is under 60%. If they're on 50%, that's when I start thinking maybe I shouldn't take them off. The pressure is helping get that oxygen in there. If they're on less than that, I can probably get that with a cannula. I can go 6 on a cannula. And I know we've been taught for years, don't go above 6 liters on a cannula. It's not good for you. You have to have the high flow to go higher than that. It's true in a sense, but it's more long-term true. Short-term, for an hour, if you're at 8 liters on your cannula, you're not going to kill them. You're not going to hurt them. So if you take them off this, and they're not working hard, and their oxygen's 40-45%, they're on minimal settings, and you take them off because they look clinically good, and you put them on 6 liters and their sat ain't quite where you want it, you can go up to 8 as long as they don't look like they're working hard. Because all they need is that oxygen. They don't need the support of this. And you reduce the risk of them vomiting in the mask and aspirating and you intubating in the truck and Larry falling out because the door came open and all this stuff. So it just makes it easier. That'd be me. So anyway, yes, if they're on minimal set, and then if it doesn't work, put it back on. You know?
On the flip side of that, then, if they're completely fighting the BiPAP, or pulling it off, and they're at like 60, 70%.
Yeah, and if they're fighting it for one reason only.
But what if they seem more comfortable on a non-rebreather?
If they're more
And
comfortable
they're actually
and you can keep their sat up,
relax,
do it.
and their sat is staying up. If they're relaxed and their sat is staying up and they're rousing the voice.
Yeah, your risk of taking them off when they're on higher settings, because they're rowdy and all that, they're rowdy for one or two reasons. One is they're claustrophobic and can't stand the mask. That is true for people who don't need it. And what I mean by that is if they can't breathe, I put the most claustrophobic people in the world on BiPAP. When they couldn't breathe, once they sensed it helping, they weren't claustrophobic to that mask anymore. They liked it. So, if they're fighting it and they're on pretty substantial settings, they're more worried if they're on higher pressures because it's giving them more physical help. I'm not so worried if they're on higher O2s because you can mimic higher O2s off of it. You can't mimic help without it. So if they're on 15/5 and they're on 100% and their sats are 97 or something, it's pretty good. You're going to get a little drop on 100% to 100% non-rebreather on their sat. You're going to get a little drop from 50% here to a 50% mask if you had it, for instance. And that's just because of the loss of EPAP or PEEP. So you don't have as many alveoli in play, but it doesn't mean you don't have enough. So if they're on 97%, 100%, 15/5, and they're fighting it, and I can't work with them and all that, first thing I would do is try to make them comfortable on it. And in that case, if their sat was good, even though they were on a lot of oxygen, I would go up on their inspiratory pressure. once my total pressure on this machine, the peak pressure, starts reading over 20, maybe close to 25, I don't go up anymore because I'm going to fill their belly, they're going to puke, they're going to aspirate in the store. Mm-hmm. So, and you can see it on this bar graph. It's gonna be, this bar graph is the closest y'all have to waveforms. Waveforms are amazing for helping synchronize. I wish they had a bit just like this with a little waveform screen. It would be amazing for you guys.
They got one that you add on to that now.
So you think they're going to buy y'all that, right?
No.
You work at Novant, right? You're lucky they don't take this one out. What happened to my screen? Well,
It was cheaper.
they had a yard sale down in front. But surprisingly enough, this pressure manometer can tell you a lot about synchronizing with your patient, and we'll get into that. And I feel like we're talking a lot about stuff, so I hope we're not running late on time. I don't
It's
know.
about 20 till 7.
No
Yes,
kidding.
we got 20 minutes.
All right, I need to move it up. All right.
Well,
So-
if we need to, we can have you come back another day and we can cover some more if we need to.
If we do that, I want to go over other things besides this that might help you, like the thing about non-rebreathers. How many people in here knew that you have to crank a non-rebreather as high as it'll go? Don't be shy, raise your hand.
I thought the big thing
I
with
thought you
not
I just looked at the
breather
bag.
was the bag.
Yeah, and the bag means nothing. It did, you know, when you started 50 years ago.
One.
No, just kidding. Back when I started, back when we didn't wear gloves, if you wore gloves, somebody thought you were, what, you don't want to touch me? Particularly, you know. So yeah.
I got a question here. I've also heard, like, if you put a bag mask on somebody,
Mhm.
it's not going to their face unless you're squeezing it back, because it's
That's
the
true.
one-way valve.
There's two different
Yes.
kinds of bags, and we'll get into that real quick. But every bag, when you're pushing in and when they're exhaling, that oxygen's still flowing. So it goes two different kinds of bags. All right, the kind of bag that shoots the oxygen out of the port on the end of it towards your patient or your mask or your ET tube. The kind of bag that does that you can hold over a baby's face, you're going to be a baby, and give a pediatric kid blow-by with the Ambu bag from the front. The only kind in the world that does that is an anesthesia bag. And what I mean by that is it's not self-filling. Any bag that is flat, when it's not connected, you can't give them blow-by through the end of it. There is a way to do it. The way to do it is you squeeze it slowly into their face. You don't have to have it sealed. The kind of bags that y'all use, we use everything. It's the rubber bags that when you squeeze them, without being hooked to oxygen, they pop back open.
Right.
Those are self-filling bags. The extra oxygen goes either into a big tubing on the end, which is the reservoir, or it goes into that bag and then vents out in the air. So the extra oxygen ain't shooting out the end at your patient. If you got somebody breathing on their own and they don't want you blowing air into them, they're fighting that, but they need that oxygen, and that's your 100% device. Hold it on their face and make it seal. You don't have to squeeze it. If you make it seal, they'll suck the oxygen through it with almost no resistance. Okay? And the way you can tell if it's working, this ain't a great, but in an Ambu bag, if you look down right into the port from the backside, there's called a duckbill valve. It opens, and you can see that it's open. That is a great way to count your patient's respiratory rate, too. If you're bagging them or you're holding it on their face, and they're breathing spontaneously through it, I don't have Billy Bob bagging them, and I look down through here, I can see every time they take a breath, I can see how big it is by how long the thing's open. All right? The best way, another thing while I'm on bag, see, these are the things I'd love to come back and talk about.
We can do it, like I said, we can do another class before.
The other thing, the best way to synchronize with a patient when you're mask bagging them, even on an ET tube or a mask, most people do what? They watch for chest rise. The minute they see it, they squeeze. You do it by feel. You put a little bit of squeeze on the bag, just enough that when they start to suck in, your hand's going to collapse. And then you know when your hand starts to collapse, make it collapse faster. That synchronizes with them like a machine does, and they won't fight you near as much. If you wait and are watching their chest, he starts to breathe in, and then I do this, I'm a half a second behind, he ain't comfortable. So like you said, do it by feel. Put a little bit of pressure on the bag, and then if they've got a decent inspiratory effort, they're sucking in fairly decent, that bag will collapse into your hand, and that's when you go with it. And it's the most synchronized you're ever going to get with a bag. You can be doing something else and do it. And y'all know y'all do 5 things at once. So you need to be able to do something else and do it. So that, you're exactly right. That's the best thing to do. What are we doing? All right. All right, so those are the 3 breath patterns. That's what makes up almost every mode of ventilation. Assist control, it's taking all the work from the patient, whether we give them a breath on our terms or they start it on their own. We do everything from there. They have no work. IMV, they can start a breath. If they start a breath at the time the machine was going to give them one, they get a full breath. If in between they try to take breaths, it gives them very little help, more so if you have pressure support added or none if you don't, and they have to do the work on these. So, if this guy's air hungry, you go to this, okay? If you get them on CPAP, PSV, go to this anyway. You know, just switch them over anyway, all right? If you're getting a patient with higher tidal volumes than you think's good, what would make me decide to cut it down and start changing things away from where I was, where I had to compensate and all that? Peak pressure. They're getting 700 and their peak pressure is 40, you're overstretching them. They're getting 700 and their peak pressure is 10, then most likely they're sucking in real hard and they need that volume. Does that make sense? And you can always see the peak pressure right here, breath to breath. You can know real quick. And while I'm on it, since we're running out of time, if you've got a patient on assist control or IMV and on a machine breath or up here on any breath, see if I can make it happen. And they're doing something like that, then they're hitting that peak pressure limit, and it may be your tidal volume, if you're in volume, needs to come down, okay? I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this on this vent, but I'll try to make it simple. You got a patient on a tidal volume set, and it only applies in volume mode, and I'm going to explain volume and pressure in just a minute. That pressure manometer either starts up, then drops back down, and then goes back up. What that looks like on a waveform for us would be that breath did that, okay? And what that means is it started giving them the breath, it started decelerating the flow like it does, but they were sucking in to the point they tried to increase that flow again. So as it's tapering off the flow, 60, 50, 40, 30, at some point it's dropped below what they're sucking in. So at that point, they're working hard. So if I have anybody on, since your vent's weird, but it's cool. If I have anybody on this, all right, and their tidal volume is decent, say it's 500, and that's maybe a little big for somebody as tiny as she is, or you just think it may be a little bit bigger. If you want to do the math, mils per kilogram, fine. If, in y'all's case, I'd stay to 6, between 6. We use 4 to 6 on most patients. In y'all's case, you're going to pick them up more like 8 to 10 in some patients. I would say go try to shoot for 8. That way, in the short term, it's helping ventilate them. And the main thing you guys got to do in the bus to make them comfortable is satisfy their drive to breathe. Their drive to breathe is satisfied by correcting their oxygen and correcting their CO2. All right. So if that pressure goes up, drops, and then goes back up, or it never goes up very high at all, then that means that you're not blowing the air in as fast as they're sucking in. Okay? And I knew I wasn't going to do this. I brought some filters so y'all could breathe through it if we had time. I didn't know I was going to talk so much. It ain't worth it if we don't have time, but I'm going to see if I can do this on my mouth. Where's the reset? Right there? You see how that went negative? How the pressure went negative? It went from the 0 over that way. That was an extreme version of me sucking in faster than it's blowing out, okay? So, in that case, what you want to do, since you don't have the ability and volume to change their flow, shorten their I time. That increases the flow. The faster you blow it in, the less time it takes. So if you give it less time to get that volume in, you know you're increasing the flow, right? Like I said earlier, if you're blowing it in at 500 in 1 second and you're now doing 500 in half a second, it's blowing twice as hard. So if that pressure manometer goes negative at any point during the breath, any point, or it goes up, comes down, then goes back up before it ends the breath, you need to start shortening the out time. That'll increase the flow, they'll get their air faster, and they'll feel like you're their best friend. That's the biggest thing you can do on a transport to get somebody synchronized quickly is out. It's just like the non-rebreather. You want to outdo how fast they're sucking in, okay? And the only way without waveforms to know that is to watch that bar. If it does that, it's great. If it goes below that at any point, they're outdoing it. Or if it goes up, drops, and goes back up, they're outdoing it. Shorten the out time. Never go below 0.7, okay? If you get to 0.7, every time you do that, their peak airway pressures are going to go up a little bit, but that's okay. It's not stretching them, it's resistance, okay? So don't panic over peak pressures increasing when you shorten the out. That pressure doesn't get to their lungs. It's actually back. You're blowing it so fast, it's back pressure in the circuit. It's not pressure in their lungs.
What are they calling me?
It's like,
Critical care transports, Rob.
this is the ET2 right here, okay? This is the ventilator, this is their lungs. I'm blowing so fast this way that the
Which
amount
one?
of air can't get through this tube to their lungs as fast as I'm blowing. So the pressure in the
Yeah.
ventilator, where it measures the
Well,
pressure
not-
for that,
The other team's doing
goes
that.
up,
Not
and as
me
the
and my
air
partner,
finally
but the
gets
other
through
team.
the tube, it'll come down. But at this point, you've got pressure built up here, the ET tube.
I don't know if
The pressure
I
is
don't know
not
if it is right this
transferring.
minute
So
or
my
not.
point is
Who's doing current
if
level?
you got them peaking at 25 and you go down on their eye time, their peaks are going to go up, but it's not stretching them anymore.
Hold on just a
So
minute.
if you have to cut their eye time down because they're
Yeah, she asked
drawing
about
negative
McLean.
pressure, they're retracting, they look like they're not getting it fast enough, go down in increments till you get to 0.7. Don't worry too much about the increase in pressure. It really is not an increase in their lung pressure. But anyway, all right, so now, next thing we need to talk about before we get out of here is breath types. So far, we've gone over 3 modes of ventilation, right? Sys control, IMV, and, or SIMV, and CPAP PSV. What makes 5 modes that we use? We use a sys control pressure control, sys control volume control. Both of those are this mode. We use SIMV pressure, SIMV volume. That's 2 different versions of this one. And then we use CPAP PSV, that's the only version of that. So, what makes the 2 versions of this different is the breath type, is how it blows the air in, okay? Volume ventilation says, I'm going to deliver whatever volume you put. I'm going to blow 500 into their lungs, and I'm going to do it in this amount of time. It calculates, that means I'm going to have to start blowing at 62 liters a minute. That's where it knows to start. It blows till that volume is delivered, and it lets it out. We use pressure ventilation. A lot of hospitals are still using volume, so you're going to get that. And pressure ventilation, can I lose my eraser that I was playing with?
So they got some weird settings up here. They're calling them all kind of things. CSM or different names. I can't even remember what they're called.
CMV. CMV is this. I'll show you something real quick. Oh, these are articles that go over each mode. Y'all can take. On assist control, it has more detail. It goes over a bunch of the stuff that we're talking about, but in a kind of slightly different perspective. But you'll be able to relate to it, and that can clear up any other questions. But that's a good thing to read through. It won't take you but a minute. But look, I want to show you one thing here that I thought was cool. Where is it? That's how many modes of ventilation that I came up with quickly.
Wow.
5 of them are the basis for all this. The differences are differences in how this one piece is done. Okay? I'm going to go quick. Assist control, pressure control. They have adaptive flow, adaptive support, airway pressure release, CMV, CMV auto flow, CMV pressure limited, CPAP, DUPAP, DURPAP, on and on. All they are is variants on how the breath is. If you can remember the 5 different versions I'm telling you today, you'll never get a patient that isn't on one of these versions. They may call it supercalifragilistic, but it's one of these things, okay? And it's basically because this company can't call bi-level ventilation bi-level because Draeger has a patent on it. Servo calls adaptive or airway pressure release. Some call it bi-level. They're exactly the same, but they can't call them the same different ventilators. So there's 47 different types of ventilators, I think, right now. All right, so let's get rid of him. All right, so what I'm going to show you now is the difference in the pressure and volume breaths, and that'll make up the 5. You've learned 3 different breath patterns. The other 2, which aren't technically modes, but we consider them modes, is when you add a different breath type to the modes I've talked about, okay? So this is a volume breath. That's all we've talked about. It delivers a set volume at a certain amount of time. When that volume has been delivered in that amount of time, it lets them exhale and does it again. The other version is pressure control. Pressure control, this is assist control because of the pattern, volume control because of the breath type. Okay? So the next one is assist control, PC, pressure control. Okay? And what it does is it kind of goes up like this and then it tapers a little different and then it ends and lets them exhale. It's not as sharp as this. On volume ventilation, this breath will look exactly the same every breath. This one, the waveform could essentially be a little bit different. The next breath, it could change a little, but it's a pressure breath. And what the machine's doing in this one, it's time for a breath, same pattern of breathing in this as there is this. When the time comes, it's going to start the breath. If the patient triggers it, it's going to start, and it's still going to give them the full breath. The pattern is the same. The difference is, once that breath is started, how it's delivered. That's the difference between this and this. All right, when this one starts, the machine says, I'm not going to give them 500 and start it and blow it for a minute and then let it out. I'm going to inflate their lungs to a set pressure. Say you set the inspiratory pressure at 25. The machine says, all right, breath time, inflate to 25, and immediately blow as hard as it can, which is important, as hard as it can until that pressure of 25 is reached. Once it reaches that pressure, your lungs are starting to open up or you're breathing in, so it has to maintain that pressure for the time you have set. Say you have it set at 1 second at a time. As opposed to this one, which decreases how fast it's blowing in, and then lets them exhale when that amount is reached. This one inflates them to 25, holds that 25 of pressure for the entire second, no matter how the shape is. This is all how the flow is slowing down. Whether they're opening up, if their lungs are really stiff, this may be more out here. If their lungs are very compliant, it's not going to take long at all. But the point about this is it inflates their lungs to that pressure as fast as it can. It holds it for the entire set I time, and then it lets them exhale. The difference is you will never see in pressure control that pressure go up, slow down, and go back up. You'll never see it drop below the first click on this machine here and stay down there. And the reason is it's blowing this out up to 90 liters a minute. So you hardly ever find somebody sucking in more than that. So that means it's constantly blowing in faster than they're sucking in, okay? Now, you wonder, well, how much air is it going to give them? That depends on how stiff their lungs are, how long you let it hold that pressure at 25, the more that opens up, because at the end of this breath, they exhale, and it measures how much came out, and that's your tidal volume. So if I set them on 20 of inspiratory pressure to blow 1 second, and they were on volume ventilation at 500, and I do that and I get 400 cc's exhaled tidal volume, well then I need to increase that inspiratory pressure to get the volume coming out each breath I want. Okay? So, there's 3 things in each breath. 2 are constant, 1 changes. Okay? In a volume breath, the amount of air is constant, and the time, or in some machines, the flow is constant. So the only thing that can vary, depending on if their lungs are stiff or if they're working against you, is the pressure it takes to get that. If I blow 500 in somebody, great athlete, good lungs, nothing's wrong, the peak pressure may be 20. If I blow 500 in somebody in CHF who's got really wet lungs, the peak pressure could be 35. I had the same amount of air going in 2 identically built sized people. Their lungs should be the same. The only difference is B's lungs are stiff, so it reaches that pressure before it gets that much air in. So, volume ventilation, the volume you're delivering, tidal volume, and the time on your machine or the flow on some machines are constant. You set those. So then what you look for is the exhale tidal volume. No, I'm sorry. What you look for is the pressure in the cheeks. If you put them on this and they're peaking 45, you've got to either give it longer to get the air in, which means it'll blow slower, or you got to start decreasing their tidal volume because you're over distending it. Okay?
Let's show us PEEP on there, PIP.
PIP, yeah. You'll see it listed here, but you'll also see it where that last beat stays is the PIP as well. You
How
can
is it
see
adjusted with the buttons?
what the PIP.
Like if you needed to adjust from
Yeah,
20 to
25.
35 because of the CHF or whatever, because the volume is 400 and not 500, how would
Okay.
you adjust the
All right.
pressure on here?
That's in volume ventilation, okay? So you don't adjust the pressure, you adjust things that yield in the pressure being higher. That's kind of the thing we're going over now is that in volume ventilation, there's 3 pieces to every breath. What you're blowing in, how fast you're blowing it in and how long it takes, those are interchangeable. And then the pressure it takes. If I fill up a small balloon with 500 cc's, the pressure in that balloon is going to be great. If I fill up a big balloon with 500 cc's, there's not going to be much pressure in there. Because that balloon is more elastic. It's less compliant. It's stiffer. Okay. So I would never adjust it to change that pressure necessarily upwards. But if I had this patient on here and their lungs were stiff and I was getting peak pressures of 35 every breath, 33 one breath, 34 the next, I would consider either giving them a little bit longer for that same amount of air to get in, so it doesn't have to get the pressure so high so quick, or I'd just decrease the tidal volume a little bit if it was on the upper end of what I was comfortable with, okay? In volume ventilation, this is the difference. In volume, it doesn't set a certain volume. Out of those 3 things you have, you set the pressure, the peak pressure. In volume ventilation, you set volume and time, and the pressure varies depending on how stiff. In pressure control, you set that peak pressure, so every breath, that pressure is going to stop where you set it. But
So
now,
is the pressure, so what I'm saying is with the pressure control, which button is it that you're changing?
on pressure control, it's the
It's the
pressure control.
plus.
You don't have a volume anymore.
No, that's
Yeah,
what I was
yeah,
wondering.
you're
is
right.
with the
Mhm.
pressure control, which one it was that you were changing?
Yeah, and that's pressure control plus P.
Right.
I just put it in pressure mode
Yeah.
that we have, so.
Mhm. That's great, and it's in
Yeah, if you want
IMP.
assist
Now, it
control.
doesn't have to be because nobody's spontaneously breathing.
Oh, okay.
So it's only going to give the machine delivered breath. So
Okay.
IMB and assist are the same if the patient ain't breathing. But the only other thing that I wanted to get in real quick is the other side of this, which is the pressure control version, which is what we use. Each breath, we don't inflate to a certain volume and then let it out. We inflate their lungs to a certain pressure,
Right.
and whatever volume comes out is what we adjust by.
Right. Right.
So pressure control has a set pressure, a set time, and the exhale tidal volume varies depending on your patient. Volume ventilation, you have a set volume, a set time, and the pressure varies.
Right.
So the goods and bads of both. real quick, volume control, you're guaranteeing that that patient's going to get that volume. So if you get a blood gas on volume ventilation and you don't make much changes, chances are it's going to stay about the same. If their lungs get stiff, they're still going to get that volume. Their peak pressure may go up or down if their lungs get better, but you know they're going to get 500 every time. In pressure control, which takes more monitoring because things change, you're going to get the same pressure every time. If they start getting wet, their tidal volume is going to start going down. You may come back in an hour and they're getting 300 exhaled now when they were getting 400. So they could become acidotic without the alarms going off or you noticing it. So in pressure control, you want closer alarm limits. So if it decreases, you know, hey, it's getting worse, I need to make some changes.
Okay, so what changes would you make? If their volume is going down, like you said, to 300, I got a pressure control of 30. Am I gonna?
I do one or two things. I got your point. I do one or two things. The benefit to these two is what helps me determine what I do. For one, you're guaranteed a volume and volume control. That's the benefit of that. That's great to use in a small hospital where people ain't looking at the minute quite often. Pressure control, you're guaranteed the pressure, so you know you'll never overextend them, distend them, but you could get them acidotic by losing volume if it's not paid attention to. So, if that's you and you're on pressure control, and you started in your trip and they were 450, and now you look and they're laying there relaxed, and their pressures or their exhale volume's down to 300, then you got two choices. If your peak pressure is already kind of high, meaning it's 30 to 35, I wouldn't go over that. I would go up on the rate to make up for the lost volume, because it all comes down to minute ventilation. If I had them on 500 or rate of 10 and I had a 5-liter minute ventilation and that was good, and now they're down to 400 and I have a 4-liter a minute ventilation, but the peak pressures are high, I don't want to go up on the volume again or on the pressure, I would increase the rate to get that lost liter of air. Meaning at 400, I'd probably go up 2 or 3 breaths. That would get you back to the 5, the minute ventilation that you're targeting. If I had that same patient and their peak, they lost 100 of their tidal volume, and their peak pressure is only 25 now, I'd go up to 30. Keep the rate the same. Go up on your inspiratory pressure to get that volume back.
So the VTE is the tidal volume exhale.
Exactly.
And that, so whatever number comes up with that, that's so if it's a really high tidal volume exhale, higher than
On
you would
pressure
think,
ventilation?
on pressure ventilation, can you have too high?
Yes. What
You would want to decrease the pressure.
Pressure.
then.
Perfect.
So, like for Heather, if she was on 25 pressure control and her tidal volumes were like 700,
Yes. Too
then
big.
you would.
Now, I've
you-
heard it's
then you
just
would want to
rumors.
turn
She's
it
got
up.
big lungs. But I have no
Screeching.
confirmation.
Oh, see,
I think
this
it's written on the
helps
wall
so
in one of the
much.
bathrooms on ground floor.
Probably.
But I heard she's got big lungs.
So the PIP is the amount of pressure. That's like the pressure.
PIP is the total pressure. It's the inspiratory
So
plus
the
pressure.
36,
Mhm.
would that be considered about as high as you would want
That
to
would
go
be as
down?
high as I would go.
Okay.
And if you drop the inspiratory pressure to get that 700 down, if she looked okay with the lower volume, I wouldn't necessarily go up on her rate to compensate, because she always has the ability to breathe over the set rate. So she may be breathing 10 on 10, and I drop her volume, and she breathes a little over on her own. That's great.
So if you've got Heather on these settings right here, and you've got a tidal volume of 672, and you've got a PIP 36.
36. First
What
thing I
kind
would
of
do
adjustments?
is I would take the peak pressure, and I would go down 2 or 3.
Okay.
I would see what the next exhaled volume is. I know I just
So you
dropped the
can
peak.
tell that close. You can
Breath
tell
to
that.
breath. I'd give it 3 or 4 to make sure it levels out.
Okay.
But you can see the peak pressure went from 36 to 31 or 2 right there.
33. Okay.
33, and then the exhale volume, it won't show it now just because I'm looking.
It really won't.
611. I'd probably go a little bit more.
So would you go off of, is that when you would go off of the 6 to 8 milliliters
Yeah.
per kilogram?
I
and
would, as
that's
long
the
as you
goal?
look comfortable.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, and that's the goal that you would want
Yes.
to kind of keep.
That's a safe place that guarantees you're going to get as much ventilation without being dangerous, and in your case, more ventilation is important. If you get a patient who's in the back of the bus and they look good earlier, they look good on these settings, you got to figure out something. Or they look good when you start, but they don't look good anymore. You got to figure that out.
Yeah.
I'm going to end this real quick. So now you know about assist control with volume. The breath is a volume breath. Those are constant pressure varies. You know about SIMV with volume ventilation. That's VC or SIMV/VC. Each machine breath is a volume breath just like this one with a set amount of air going in. Pressure varies. They can breathe spontaneously in between, either assisted or unassisted by some pressure support. Air-hungry patients, get them off this, get them on this. Okay, that'll fix most of them. And start with the same settings you had in this. Say if they're on IMV of 8, put them on this or assist control of 8. Even if they're breathing 20, now they'll be breathing 20 with these smaller ones in between are now bigger. That'll slow their rate and get them comfortable. To make people comfortable breathing, you got to satisfy their oxygen, you got to satisfy their CO2. Increasing their spontaneous efforts without them having to increase the work drops their CO2, and they work less, they feel better. All right, so now you know what pressure assist control does. It's the pressure breath in this pattern. You know what the volume in this pattern is. It's two of them. You know the IMV with volume. Now you know IMV where these breaths are pressure-based. That's the fourth mode. The fifth is the spontaneous, which is mimicking CPAP on a vent. It's CPAP with pressure support, which y'all shouldn't use. If you know those modes and pressure breath combinations, you'll never get a patient who's on anything different. You may get somebody with bi-level, but you'll have a therapist and a machine that does it with you.
But they're probably going for ECMO, right?
Yes. And then, as far as if you got somebody who's air hungry and their sats are good and they're on assist control, the last thing I'm going to say is there's two, and I'm learning this more and more of these years. Most people, when they get tired of their CO2's a little up and they're tired, they can't breathe anymore. Most of us, if our CO2 jumped 10 points, we breathe faster to compensate. Some of these people who have, and it may happen more in the hospital than with you, but it could happen on a transport from a hospital. He was fine for 3 days, now he's sicker, send him to Baptist. Because we don't want him, we're full. So he could be tired of breathing. So if you get him and he's working hard, and he's already on assist control, and you think that the volume's right, he's on a rate of 10, but he's breathing 18, going up on the rate doesn't matter, because every breath, he's getting 18 full breaths anyway, so going to 15 doesn't change it. His oxygen's good. The only thing left to do is to somehow get more air in his chest. I would suggest to you, we see a lot that are too tired to breathe 30 times a minute anymore. So when they get tired, the next thing if your muscles are so weak you can't breathe 30 a minute, every one of us would do the same thing. We would start taking a huge volume, one breath, and then we would blow forcefully for 8 or 10 seconds and take another one. It looks like somebody who's having an asthma attack as far as they exhale forever. They may even squeeze a little bit, but they do this. They go, and they're forcing it out. Problem with that is the machine's trying to blow a machine breath because the time came to give a breath. They're blowing out, so what does it do? The peak pressure is hit immediately because they're blowing one way, it's blowing the other, and their exhaled volume is nothing almost. It's 20, 30, 40 cc's. So if you think they need more ventilation, I'll turn their rate up. It's not going to help because the breaths you're adding are now he's blowing out against them anyway, so you're not getting any volume in them. So the trick that we've learned over the years is if you've got that patient who's going, and you're trying to blow air in and it's hitting the pressure limit, and then they suck in a liter because they timed it and it let them have the breath, and they get a liter volume and you only had it set at 600, it'll let them overbreathe it. And then they start that exhalation again, and you're trying to give another breath, and it won't do it. You can turn that rate up and do this all day long. It won't go in. Take them off the vent, bag them fairly quickly, and what you're doing is their oxygen's good, their oxygen's fine, so they're not triggered to breathe by that, but their CO2 is bad. And it doesn't even have to be off by far. Most of them are in the 732 range, 731 or whatever. They're not off by much. If you bag them for 3 or 4 minutes, you drop their CO2 down to below normal for them. So then their body says, their receptors tell their brain, hey, my oxygen's good. My CO2 is lower than it's ever been. I don't need to breathe. It's almost like hitting them with Dipperman. They just totally relax for a few minutes. Now, if you don't do anything different, when you stop that, blood's going to circulate in about 3 to 4 minutes. They're going to start that funny pattern again. But it buys you a window to where you can cut their rate up, and they're not blowing against it for that 3 or 4 seconds. So your goal is, they're on a rate of 20, they're blowing against it, I'm not getting anything in on 3 out of 4 of the breaths. I bag them pretty vigorously for a few minutes, and you can watch them, they'll stop breathing. Their effort will go away. It's like you give them a Tominate. And when you achieve that, and it works in 90% of the patients, when you achieve that, you know their CO2 is lower than what triggers their breathing. So at that point, put them back on the vent, go up a couple on the rate. Then, while they're relaxed from the hyperventilating and their CO2 hasn't risen back on its own to stimulate them to breathe again, you'll have time for those extra breaths you dialed in to breathe, to get in. So they're coming along here with a CO2 of 50. You take them off and bag them, their CO2 drops to 30. Here's where you stop bagging them. It starts climbing again, but you've increased the respiratory rate. At this line, you had them on 10. Now you've got them on 14. So now their CO2 only goes up to this point because you're breathing faster. So they never get back to that area that made them breathe that funny pattern. So they're working against you. You get a big tidal volume and then 3 or 4 that are nothing, and a big tidal volume, 3 or 4 that are nothing. Those patients have a panic look on their face. They're sweating. Nothing you're going to do is going to fix them. And, I mean, unless you completely knock them out, which why do that if you can fix it with the vent? So my suggestion is take them off, bag them a few minutes. In the meantime, cut your rate up, put them back on the vent. The CO2 won't climb to that level that makes them breathe hard, and your ride will be good. If you do that, and you cut their rate up from 10 to 12, and it comes back to that level, they'll start it again. And you know, all right, I didn't go enough up on the rate. Bag them again, go up 2 more breaths. Don't make a big jump because you could end up overventilating. But bag them, put them back on with two more breaths a minute. If they do it again, take them off, bag them a few minutes till they stop breathing, put them back on with 2 more breaths a minute. At some point, you'll get their CO2 just under what triggers that funny rate, and they'll ride smooth the rest of the day. We do that in the units a lot to prevent having to put people on paralytics or on things like that. We always try that first.